app. Listen via The 1%, Gone Bad, Part 5. Population without leverage. MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sunu MIX. April 11, 2026. Part 5, The Subdued Periphery. 21. Population without leverage. Leverage is not power. This distinction is the one that most political analysis collapses, the conflation that makes the condition of the subdued periphery so difficult to accurately describe and so easy to misdiagnose. Power is the capacity to act, to apply force, to move resources, to alter the conditions of a situation through the direct exercise of capability. Leverage is something different. Leverage is the capacity to make your action matter to someone who has power, to convert your position in the system into a credible threat or a credible offer that the powerful must account for. The laborer who can withhold their labor does not have power in the direct sense, they cannot compel the factory owner to do anything. But they have leverage. The withdrawal of their indispensable contribution would cost the factory owner enough that the threat of withdrawal becomes something the factory owner must negotiate around. The voter who can withdraw their vote does not have power, they cannot directly alter policy. But they have leverage, aggregated with other voters, their potential defection is something the politician must account for. Leverage is the conversion of position into influence, the mechanism by which those without direct power make their interests matter to those with it. Every prior system of domination, however brutal, however asymmetric, was constrained by the leverage of the dominated. The dominated could withhold, could organize, could make the cost of ignoring them high enough that ignoring them became more expensive than accommodation. The subdued periphery has no leverage. Not weakened leverage. Not reduced leverage. No leverage. The specific, structural, engineered absence of the capacity to make your position matter to those whose decisions determine your conditions. The condition of the population that the compound has rendered not merely powerless but leverageless. Irrelevant to the operation of the system that governs their world. Present in the system's territory but absent from its calculations. Existing without the one thing that prior political theory assumed all existing populations possessed. The ability to make their existence cost something to those deciding their fate. To understand how leverage is lost, you must first understand how leverage was held. The majority's leverage, historically, was never a single thing. It was a portfolio, a set of distinct pressure points, each representing a different way in which the majority's position in the system could be converted into costs for those who operated the system. Labor leverage. The withdrawal or threat of withdrawal of the physical and cognitive labor on which the system's operation depended. This was the majority's oldest leverage, the leverage of the irreplaceable body, the indispensable hands, the knowledge only the worker possessed of how the machine actually ran. Every labor movement in history was built on this leverage. The strike worked because the factory couldn't run without the workers, couldn't be replaced at the speed that the strike's economic cost demanded. The compound has automated. The labor leverage is gone, not diminished, gone, in every sector where automation has been deployed. The compound's agricultural systems do not require farm workers. The compound's manufacturing does not require factory workers. The compound's logistics does not require warehouse workers. The compound's security does not require human guards. The majority's bodies are not needed. The irreplaceability that was the foundation of leverage has been engineered away, function by function, sector by sector, until the portion of the compound's operation that requires human labor from outside its walls is small enough to manage through selective employment and controlled dependency. Consumer leverage. The withholding or threat of withholding of the purchasing power on which the system's markets depended. The boycott worked because the corporation needed the consumer's spending, needed the revenue that the consumer's participation in the market generated. The compound does not need the periphery's consumption. The compound's closed economy generates and circulates value internally. Its markets are not the outside's markets. Its revenue is not dependent on the purchasing power of the abandoned majority. The majority can withhold their consumption. They can boycott. The compound does not notice. What the majority does not buy is not what the compound sells. The consumer leverage is gone. Electoral leverage. The threat of voting against the government whose policies favor the compound as the mechanism through which democratic majorities extract policy responsiveness from elected officials. Electoral leverage depends on the elected officials' ability to implement policies that actually affect the compound, depends on the democratic government having jurisdiction over the compound's operations. The compound has removed itself from democratic jurisdiction. Its territory is not subject to the electoral mandate. Its operations are not governed by the legislation that the electoral majority can produce. Its wealth is not captured by the tax policy that the electoral majority can demand. The vote that throws the government out produces a new government that faces the same structural reality. The compound is outside the jurisdiction that the government's mandate covers. The electoral leverage is gone, not because democracy has been destroyed but because the compound has moved to where democracy does not reach. Legitimacy leverage. The withdrawal of the moral and social recognition on which the governing structure's claim to authority depended, the leverage of the governed's belief that the governing has the right to govern. Legitimacy leverage is the leverage of the colonized who delegitimize the colonial power, the leverage of the civil rights movement that exposed the gap between democracy's claims and its practice, the leverage of the anti-apartheid movement that made the cost of international recognition too high for the regime to sustain. The compound does not require the periphery's recognition. It has built a governance structure whose operation does not depend on the belief of those outside it in its legitimacy. The compound does not seek the periphery's approval. It does not require the periphery's participation in the narrative of its legitimacy. It is indifferent, structurally, architecturally, operationally indifferent, to whether the periphery considers it legitimate. The legitimacy leverage is gone, because leverage requires that the lever connect to something that can be moved, and the compound has decoupled its operation from any mechanism through which the periphery's withdrawal of recognition could produce consequences the compound must address. The loss of leverage is not experienced as the loss of leverage. This is the feature of the condition that makes it most difficult to organize around and most difficult to even name as a political condition rather than a personal one. The loss of leverage is experienced as the reform that doesn't happen. The policy change that was clearly necessary, clearly demanded, clearly supported by a majority of the affected population, and that did not occur. Not suppressed violently. Not prevented by force. Simply not implemented, because the governing structure that nominally had the authority to implement it did not have the actual capacity to do so, the actual capacity having been relocated to institutional structures outside the democratic mandate's reach. The reform was demanded. The demand was heard. The governing structure expressed sympathy. The governing structure passed a resolution. The resolution had no enforcement mechanism that reached where the reform was needed. The reform did not happen. This experience, the reform that doesn't happen, is the lived texture of leverage loss. It is not dramatic. It does not produce a visible event around which outrage can organize. It produces, instead, the specific demoralization of populations that have learned, through repeated experience, that their demands produce acknowledgement and not change. That the mechanism through which their leverage was supposed to operate no longer connects to anything that moves. The subdued periphery's condition has structural parallels in governance architectures that are, on their surface, ideologically distant from the compound's technocratic model. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the governance structure it embodies offer a specific and instructive parallel, not in ideology, not in the content of its claims, but in the structure of its relationship to the population it nominally governs. The IRGC is an example of the control inward logic, the governing structure that has organized itself to be responsive to its own internal hierarchy, its own theological and political leadership, and progressively unresponsive to the population nominally under its governance. The Iranian population generates demands for economic reform, for social liberalization, for political accountability, that the governing structure acknowledges, manages, suppresses, and ultimately does not implement, not because the population lacks numbers, not because the population lacks organization, not even entirely because the population lacks resources, but because the governing structure has insulated itself from the population's leverage through an architecture of parallel institutions, the IRGC's economic empire, its security infrastructure, its parallel governance mechanisms that provide the governing structure with the resources, the security, and the operational continuity it needs to function without the population's cooperation or consent. The population of Iran is not powerless in the absolute sense. Its uprisings are real. Its organization is real. Its demands are real. But its leverage, its capacity to make those demands cost something to the governing structure, is structurally limited by the architecture of parallel institutions that have insulated the governing structure from the consequences of ignoring it. The compound achieves this insulation through technology rather than through theology, through automated self-sufficiency rather than through revolutionary ideology, but the structural result is identical. A governing structure that the governed population cannot leverage. That continues its operation regardless of what the governed population does. That is, in the precise political sense, unaccountable. Not because accountability has been rhetorically rejected, but because the mechanisms through which accountability would operate have been architecturally decoupled from the governed population's capacity to activate them. Taliban-era Afghanistan offers a different but complementary parallel, not in its specific governance content but in its structural relationship between governing structure and population. Control inward, disengagement outward. The Taliban governance model, in its most characteristic expression, was organized around the maintenance of internal order, the enforcement of the governing structure's norms within its territory, and the management of external relationships on terms the governing structure dictated. The population within its territory was not governed for the population's benefit. The population was governed for the governing structure's benefit, organized, controlled, and managed in ways that served the governing structure's ideological, economic, and security requirements, with the population's own interests addressed only insofar as they aligned with the governing structure's priorities. The international community applied leverage through sanctions, through diplomatic isolation, through the withholding of development assistance. And the governing structure was able to absorb this external leverage because its internal operation did not depend on the international community's cooperation. Because it had developed, within its territory, sufficient control of resources and security to maintain its operation without external validation or support. The population suffered the consequences of the governing structure's international isolation, suffered in the most literal biological sense, while the governing structure continued. The governing structure's indifference to these consequences, its capacity to maintain its operation while the population bore the cost of its isolation, is the precise structure the compound replicates. The governing class inside the wall, continuing its operation, indifferent to the costs its operation imposes on the population outside. Because its operation does not depend on that population's condition. Because the architecture of self-sufficiency that the compound has constructed insulates the governing structure from the consequences that fall on those it has abandoned. Control inward. Disengagement outward. The compound's version, optimization inward. Indifference outward. The theological content is absent. The ideological apparatus is absent. The specific enforcement mechanisms are different. But the structural relationship, the governing structure that has insulated itself from the population's leverage and therefore operates without reference to the population's interests, is the same. The population without leverage does not simply accept its condition. This is the first and most important corrective to the analysis, the resistance to the temptation to describe the subdued periphery as passive, as resigned, as absorbed into the compound's definition of it as terrain. The population without leverage is not a population without response. It is a population whose responses have not yet found the form adequate to its condition. The responses that prior leverage produced, the strike, the boycott, the election, the uprising, are not absent from the periphery. They occur. They occur and they do not connect. They exert force against a structure that has been specifically designed to absorb force without consequence. The strike in a sector the compound has automated, the striking workers withdraw labor the compound systems have already replaced. The withdrawal costs the compound nothing. The workers cost themselves everything. The boycott of compound adjacent products, the compound's closed economy circulates value internally. The boycott of its external-facing products removes a marginal revenue stream the compound had not prioritized. The majority bears the cost of organizing the boycott. The compound adjusts its external sales strategy. The electoral mandate for redistribution. The democratic government with the mandate discovers that the mechanisms for redistribution do not reach the compound's architecture, that the capital is offshore, that the operations are in zones outside the mandate's jurisdiction, that the implementation of the mandate requires international coordination, that the compound's diplomatic resources are better positioned to resist than the democratic government is positioned to impose. The uprising. The compound's perimeter absorbs the physical pressure with autonomous systems calibrated to disperse rather than escalate, to manage rather than confront, to produce the minimum force necessary to maintain the perimeter without generating the spectacle that might produce the international response, that might produce a form of pressure the compound has not yet insulated itself from. Each response is real. Each response is genuine. Each response does not connect. The population without leverage is not the population without will. It is the population whose will has not yet found its fulcrum, has not yet identified the specific point in the compound's architecture at which pressure produces movement, has not yet built the form of organization adequate to the form of domination it is organizing against. What would leverage look like for a population in this condition? The question is the most important question the subdued periphery faces, and the one its own distributed intelligence, now widely available through the AI tools the compound distributed in the period before its own self-sufficiency was complete, is actively working on. The compound distributed intelligence broadly because it needed to extract value from the cognitive labor of the majority during the transition period, the period before automation was complete enough to eliminate that dependency. The majority received the tools. The tools were used for the compound's purposes. The tools were also used for other purposes, for the analysis of the condition, for the modeling of the system, for the identification of the points at which the system is not insulated, the gaps in the architecture, the dependencies that remain, the places where the compound's self-sufficiency is not yet complete. The AI tools that the compound distributed are now being used to map what the compound has built. To model, with the same analytical sophistication that the compound's governing class uses to model the outside. The inside. The architecture, the dependencies, the failure modes, the specific points at which the compound's indifference to the outside is not yet structural but provisional. Maintained not by the completion of the exit but by the assumption that the outside cannot organize a response adequate to the architecture it is organizing against. That assumption is the compound's most important unexamined premise. And the unexamined premise, in any system, however sophisticated, however augmented, is the vulnerability that the outside is now equipped to find. The history of leverage recovery, the history of populations that found leverage in conditions designed to prevent it, is not a history of frontal assault. It is a history of the unexpected pressure point. The lever that the dominating structure did not identify as a lever, because the structure's analysis was conducted from inside the structure, with the blind spots that inside produces. The British Empire did not identify the salt tax as its vulnerability in India. It was a small revenue item. It was a mundane administrative matter. It was not a pressure point by any analysis the empire's governance could conduct from inside its own frame. It was a pressure point because Gandhi could see what the empire could not, could see that the salt tax's symbolic weight exceeded its economic significance, could see that organizing around it would produce the specific form of moral pressure that the empire's international standing could not absorb. The leverage was not in the salt. It was in the empire's need for a specific kind of international legitimacy, a need the empire could not see as a need because from inside the empire's frame, its legitimacy was not a vulnerability. It was a given. The compound has its salt tax. Its unexamined need. The dependency it does not recognize as a dependency because from inside the compound's frame it does not appear as a vulnerability. What it is, specifically, precisely, is the question the population without leverage is now, with the tools the compound provided, in the process of answering. The analysis is distributed. The analysis is not coordinated, not yet. The analysis is happening in 1,000 separate places, by 1,000 separate people, without the augmented cognitive network that would allow them to synthesize it. But it is happening. And in the history of leverage recovery, the analysis always preceded the action, the identification of the unexpected pressure point always came before the pressure was applied. Sometimes by decades, sometimes by centuries, sometimes by a generation that did the analysis and a subsequent generation that applied it. But the analysis came first. And the analysis is underway. The population without leverage has one form of leverage that the compound's architecture has not fully insulated against. And that the compound's analysts consistently underweight because it is the form of leverage that augmented analytical systems are worst at modeling. Narrative leverage. The capacity of the subdued periphery to tell the story of what is happening to it, in forms that reach audiences the compound has not yet insulated itself from, in ways that produce the specific kind of moral pressure that the compound's deterrence architecture is not designed to address. The compound's deterrence architecture is designed for physical pressure, for economic pressure, for political pressure through existing institutions. It is not designed for the pressure of a story that is undeniably true, told compellingly enough, distributed widely enough, received by audiences with enough remaining stake in the values the story is invoking. To make the compound's operation cost something it was not expecting to pay. Not money. Not security. Not territorial integrity. Legitimacy. The specific legitimacy that the compound still requires from the audiences it cannot fully insulate from, the international communities, the remaining democratic institutions, the populations adjacent to the compound whose cooperation the compound still needs for the functions it has not yet automated. The legitimacy that the narrative of what the compound is actually doing to the majority it has abandoned might, if told with sufficient clarity and received with sufficient attention, begin to withdraw. The compound is not indifferent to all legitimacy. It is indifferent to the periphery's legitimacy assessment. It is not indifferent to the legitimacy assessment of the specific audiences whose cooperation it still requires. That is the pressure point. The place where the lever connects. Not the compound's perimeter. Not the compound's economy. Not the compound's governance. The compound story of what it is and why it is doing what it is doing. And the gap between that story and the story the periphery can tell from the other side of the wall is where the leverage is. Narrative is the leverage of the population without leverage. It is not sufficient leverage. Not alone. Not yet. But it is the leverage available, the pressure point the compound cannot automate away, cannot algorithmically manage, cannot fully insulate against. Because insulating against narrative requires controlling the conditions under which stories are told and received. And the compound has not yet controlled all those conditions. And the periphery, with its distributed intelligence and its direct experience of what the compound's governance feels like from beneath, is telling the story. In every form available to it, in every channel the compound has not yet closed. To every audience still capable of hearing it. And waiting for the hearing to become the thing it always becomes when a true story is told clearly enough, to enough people, who still have enough at stake in the difference between what is happening and what should be. Action. The population without leverage is not, finally, a population defined by its lack. It is a population in transition, in the specific transition between the leverage it has lost and the leverage it has not yet found. Between the forms of pressure that the compound has insulated itself against and the forms the compound has not yet imagined because the compound's analysis is conducted by augmented minds that are very good at modeling what already exists and less good at modeling what has not yet been invented. Which is what the periphery is inventing. Now. In the space of its exclusion. With the tools the compound provided. And the specific creativity that constraint produces. And the knowledge that comes from living inside the consequences of decisions you did not make. The knowledge of what the compound looks like from the outside. The knowledge the compound cannot purchase, cannot augment its way to, cannot model from inside the wall it built. The knowledge that is the periphery's only remaining advantage. And that is, in the end, the only kind of knowledge that has ever generated the unexpected pressure point that the dominating structure did not see coming. Because it could not see what it looked like from the other side of the wall it built to prevent exactly that seeing. Leverage is not power. This is what the subdued periphery must learn before it can recover what it has lost. Power is what the compound has. Leverage is what the periphery lost. They are not the same thing, and the strategies appropriate to recovering leverage are not the strategies appropriate to contesting power. Contesting power frontally is what the compound has prepared for. Its perimeter was built for frontal contest. Its deterrence was calibrated for frontal pressure. Its analytical systems model frontal approaches continuously and in real time. Recovering leverage is different. Leverage does not assault the wall. Leverage finds the place where the wall is connected to something that the wall's builders needed to connect it to, and did not recognize, in the connecting, as the point where the wall could be moved. The compound is connected, however self-sufficient, however insulated. It is connected, still, to things it needs that the peripherized position to affect. The connections are fewer than they were. They are not zero. They will not be zero until the compound is complete, and the compound is not complete. The connections are the leverage. Finding them is the work. The work is underway. The compound does not know this yet. Or it knows, and its models say the risk is low. The models are augmented. The models are very good. The models were built by people who have never had to find leverage in a condition designated to prevent it, who have never had to be creative under that specific constraint, who do not know, because they cannot know from inside the wall what that specific creativity produces. The models have a blind spot. The blind spot is the periphery. The periphery is working. 22. Automation without welfare. The deal was implicit. It was never written down, never codified in any statute, never formalized in any treaty, never acknowledged by any governing structure as the operative basis of its legitimacy. But it was real. As real as any written law. More real, perhaps, because it was inscribed not in documents but in the lived expectations of populations across the industrialized world, in the institutional architectures those expectations had generated, in the political arrangements those architectures had made stable. The deal was this. When the machine replaces you, the system compensates you. Not generously. Not always adequately. Not without the political struggle that extracted every social provision from the structures that resisted providing it. But the compensation came, the unemployment insurance, the retraining programs, the public education that prepared the next generation for the jobs the current generation's automation created, the healthcare that maintained the workforce the economy still needed, the pension that honored the labor the economy had already consumed. The deal was made possible by a specific structural condition. The economy that automated still needed the population it automated. It needed their consumption, the purchasing power of the wage earner to buy the products the automated factory produced. It needed their children's labor, the next generation's cognitive and physical contribution to the sectors the current automation had not yet reached. It needed their political acquiescence, the social stability that comes from a population that is losing one form of livelihood but being offered another, that is being displaced from one position but being invited into the next. The deal held the economy together by holding the population together, by ensuring that the disruption of automation did not produce the social fragmentation that would have made the economy's next phase impossible. The deal was not charity. It was the structural requirement of an economy that still needed the population it was disrupting. The compound has disrupted the structural condition that made the deal necessary. The compound does not need the population. And the deal, which was always structural, never moral, is off. Automation without welfare is not the absence of a policy. It is the presence of a logic, the coherent, internally consistent logic of a system that has eliminated the dependency that made welfare the price of automation and now proceeds with automation without paying the price the dependency no longer requires. The logic is not cruel. It is, and this is what makes it so difficult to contest, rational. If the purpose of welfare was to maintain the population whose continued functionality the economy required, and if the economy no longer requires the continued functionality of the majority of the population, then welfare, from the system's perspective, is not a moral obligation that has been abandoned. It is a cost that has been eliminated, a rational response to the removal of the dependency that once justified the expenditure. The automation was not deployed to eliminate welfare. The welfare was not eliminated to punish the automated. The automation was deployed because it was efficient. The welfare was eliminated because it was unnecessary. Both decisions were rational. Neither decision required malice. The combination of both decisions produces the condition of the subdued periphery. The population that has been automated without being compensated, displaced without being supported, made redundant without being maintained. The population experiencing the economic consequences of a transition that was never designed with their welfare in mind and that has now proceeded far enough that designing it in would require the compound to accept costs that the compound's current architecture is specifically organized to avoid. The history of automation's relationship to welfare follows a consistent pattern, consistent enough to constitute a law, if social dynamics admitted of laws. That the compound's architects studied carefully before determining that this time, the pattern would not apply. Phase 1. Automation creates displacement. The machine replaces the worker. The worker's income disappears. The worker's skills become less valuable. The worker's position in the economy deteriorates. This phase has occurred in every automation wave, from the textile mills through the manufacturing robots through the digital automation of cognitive work. Phase 2. Displacement creates political pressure. The displaced worker votes. The displaced worker organizes. The displaced worker's misery is visible to the political structures that require the displaced worker's compliance, visible and costly to ignore. The political pressure is real. It produces real responses, not always adequate, not always timely, but real. Unemployment insurance. Public works programs. Retraining initiatives. Social insurance expansion. The welfare state, in its various national forms, is the crystallized residue of the political pressure that prior displacement waves generated. Phase 3. Welfare absorbs pressure and enables next automation. The welfare provision reduces the political pressure sufficiently to allow the next phase of automation to proceed, buys the social stability that transition requires, maintains the population's basic functionality, produces the next generation of workers for the sectors automation has not yet reached. Phase 4. Repeat. Each wave of automation generates displacement, the displacement generates pressure, the pressure generates welfare, the welfare enables the next wave. The pattern held across 2 centuries of industrial and post-industrial development. It held because the structural condition held, each automation wave still needed the population it was displacing, for the next phase's labor, for the current phase's consumption, for the political stability that social provision purchased. The compound has exited the pattern by exiting the structural condition. The compound's automation wave is the first wave in the pattern's history that does not need the population it is displacing for anything the population can provide. The phase 2 pressure does not disappear. The displaced population still votes, in the elections that reach the governance structures the compound has not fully captured. But the phase 2 pressure no longer connects to the phase 3 provision. Because the provision would require the compound to accept redistribution from its automation gains, and the compound has constructed the legal, financial, and political architecture to prevent redistribution from reaching where it would need to reach to constitute an actual phase 3 response. The pattern breaks. Phase 2 generates no phase 3. The pressure accumulates without releasing into provision. The displaced population experiences the pressure without the release. The economic displacement without the compensation. The automation without the welfare. Indefinitely. What does automation without welfare actually look like in the lived experience of the subdued periphery? Not collapse. This is the first and most important corrective, the resistance to the dramatic framing that makes the condition easier to dismiss as hyperbole. Automation without welfare does not produce the sudden, spectacular failure of visible crisis. It produces something more durable and more insidious. The slow arithmetic of diminishment. In income. The wage that was sufficient is no longer sufficient, not because the price of everything has risen proportionally, but because the specific things that wages used to purchase, housing, healthcare, education, security, have risen at rates that the wage has not kept pace with, while the wage itself has been compressed by the availability of automated alternatives to the labor it represents. The worker who made $35 an hour in a sector the compound has partially automated makes $22 an hour now, because the automation has given the employer a credible alternative to the worker's demand, and credible alternatives compress wages the way they compress everything whose price is set by bargaining. The diminishment is not dramatic. It is annual. It is the raise that did not come, the overtime that is no longer offered, the benefits that have been restructured to transfer cost from employer to employee, each change individually manageable, cumulatively the arithmetic of a standard of living that is declining in a way that feels, at any given moment, like a rough patch, and is, in the aggregate, a structural descent without a flaw. Insecurity. The job that felt secure is no longer secure, not because the worker has become less capable but because the compound's automation research has advanced to the point where the worker's specific function is now within the range of automation's frontier. Where the employer's calculation has shifted from this worker is cheaper than the machine to this machine is cheaper than the worker, and the transition cost is manageable within this fiscal year. The insecurity is not the anxiety of the performance review. It is the anxiety of the obsolescence horizon, the awareness that the specific skills that were the worker's primary economic asset are being approached by automation from a direction the worker cannot outrun because the direction is capability itself, because the automation is becoming capable rather than the worker becoming incapable. The worker cannot solve this by working harder. Cannot solve it by retraining into the sector's automation has not yet reached, because the sector's automation has not yet reached are shrinking faster than retraining programs can redirect workers into them. Cannot solve it by political action, because the political structures that once connected displaced workers' votes to displacement-responsive policy have been captured, restructured, or rendered irrelevant by the compound's regulatory architecture. The insecurity has no solution that the worker can individually enact. It can only be solved collectively, which requires the organization that the conditions of insecurity are specifically designed to prevent. The worker who is individually afraid of losing their position does not organize collectively against the conditions producing the fear, because organizing takes time, takes visibility, takes the willingness to risk the position that the fear is organized around protecting. The insecurity produces isolation. The isolation prevents organization. The prevention of organization perpetuates the insecurity. The loop is the governance. In public provision, the schools that were adequate are no longer adequate, not because the teachers have become less capable but because the public funding that maintained the schools has been subject to the same arithmetic as every other public provision. The tax base has eroded, the compound's capital having been structured to minimize its contribution to the jurisdictions where the schools are. The political will to redistribute has been captured by the interests that benefit from the erosion, and the school is teaching the children of the automated majority with the resources available after the compound has taken its share and the remainder has been distributed across the public needs that the compound's withdrawal has multiplied. The hospital that was functioning is now under-resourced, its emergency room the primary care provider for the population that has lost the employer-provided insurance that the automated job came with, the population now managing chronic conditions in the acute care setting because there is no other setting available to them. The infrastructure that was maintained is now deferred, the roads, the water systems, the electrical grid, the digital infrastructure that the population's economic participation requires, deferred because the revenue that maintained it has followed the capital that generated it into the compound's orbit and the fiscal structures that once recycled that revenue into public provision no longer reach where the capital has gone. The public provision atrophies. The atrophy is gradual. It is not experienced as the removal of services. It is experienced as the services working a little less well than they did before, and then a little less well than that, and then less well than that. Until the population that remembers what the services were understands that what they have now is not an imperfect version of the same thing but a different thing entirely. A system of public provision organized not around the delivery of services to those who need them but around the management of the most acute failures of a population whose needs exceed what the remaining provision was designed to address. Automation without welfare creates a specific relationship between the automated population and the compound's adjacent labor market. The small portion of economic activity that the compound still sources from outside. That constitutes the subdued periphery's most immediate point of contact with the compound's economic architecture and its most intimate experience of the condition automation without welfare produces. The compound needs, still, certain kinds of labor that automation has not yet reached, or that the compound has determined is more efficiently sourced externally than produced internally. This labor is available in the periphery. The periphery needs income. The transaction appears, on its surface, like the prior relationship between employer and worker, like the economic participation that the deal promised the automated majority, there will be new work. This is the new work. But the transaction differs from the prior relationship in every structural dimension that made the prior relationship the basis of the deal's social provision. The compound's external labor sourcing is not employment in the prior sense. It is procurement, the purchase of a service from an external provider, with all the implications that the shift from employment to procurement carries. The procurement relationship has no benefits. The procured worker is a contractor, responsible for their own healthcare, their own retirement, their own income volatility management, their own professional development. The procurement relationship has no security. The contract is renewed or not based on the compound's assessment of the continued need for the service the worker provides, an assessment that the worker has no mechanism to influence and no right to contest. The procurement relationship has no trajectory. There is no career path from external contractor to compound resident, or if there is, the path runs through the entry assessment whose threshold the procurement worker by definition has not met and will not meet as long as the gap between the assessed cognitive value of the average contractor and the compound's entry threshold continues to widen. The procurement relationship is the compound solution to the awkward interval, the period during which automation is not yet complete and the compound still requires some external labor, that maintains the economic transaction while eliminating the social obligation that the prior employment relationship carried. It is the transaction without the deal. The economic participation without the provision. The labor relationship with the dependency removed, the dependency that once made the labor relationship the foundation of welfare's justification. The procured worker contributes labor. The labor is compensated. The compensation does not include what the prior employment relationship included, the access to the social insurance that the employment relationship once bundled. The worker is paid. The worker is not provided for. The payment is the transaction. The provision would have been the deal. The deal is not on offer. The political response to automation without welfare has taken, across the periphery's different regions, 3 characteristic forms, each representing a different attempt to restore the connection between automation's disruption and social provision. Each encountering the same structural obstacle, the compound's insulation from the political mechanisms through which the response is attempted. The redistributive response, the attempt to tax automation's gains and redistribute the proceeds to the displaced majority. Robot taxes. Automation levies. Wealth taxes. Digital service taxes. The various legislative attempts to capture a portion of the productivity gains that automation generates and redirect them toward the welfare provision that automation has eliminated. This response is structurally coherent. It addresses the right problem, the disconnection between automation's gains and the majority's welfare. It fails, consistently, at the implementation stage, at the point where the tax must be assessed, collected, and redistributed through the public systems that the compound has spent decades insulating itself from. The compound's capital is structured to minimize its exposure to the jurisdictions attempting the redistribution. The automation gains that should be the tax base are held in structures that the tax's implementation cannot reach without the international coordination that the compound's diplomatic resources are better positioned to prevent than the democratic governments are positioned to achieve. The redistributive response is the right answer to the wrong version of the problem, the version in which the powerful are still operating inside the tax jurisdiction of the democratic state. The compound is not operating inside that jurisdiction. The compound moved. The tax is being applied to an address the compound no longer occupies. The protectionist response, the attempt to slow automation through regulatory barriers, requirements for human employment, restrictions on automated systems in defined sectors, standards that favor human labor over automated alternatives. This response addresses the rate of displacement rather than the compensation for it, slows the automation rather than funding welfare from it. It fails at the competitive stage, at the point where the protected sector, operating with human labor at human cost, competes against the compound's automated sector operating at a fraction of the cost. The protected sector cannot compete. The protection becomes a subsidy, a public expenditure to maintain the economic fiction of competitive human labor in sectors where automation has made human labor structurally uncompetitive. The subsidy is expensive. The expense is borne by the public. The public is the automated majority whose taxes are funding the protection of the employment they are trying to protect. The protectionist response is the right answer to the wrong problem, the problem being competitive viability, when the real problem is the absence of the structural dependency that once made welfare the price of automation. The radical response, the attempt to reimagine the relationship between automation and provision outside the framework of the prior employment relationship. Universal basic income, public ownership of automated means of production, democratic control of AI development, the reorganization of the social contract around contribution broadly defined rather than employment narrowly measured. This response addresses the right problem in the right framework, acknowledges that the employment relationship that was the prior deal's foundation has been structurally altered and that the provision must therefore be reconstituted on a different foundation. It fails at the political stage, at the point where implementing it requires the coordination of democratic majorities across multiple jurisdictions, sustained over the political cycles necessary to build the institutional infrastructure the response requires, against the consistent opposition of the compound's political influence. The influence of the class whose automation gains fund the political opposition to the redistribution of those gains. The radical response is the right answer. It is the right answer that cannot be implemented fast enough, at sufficient scale, with sufficient political durability. Because the conditions that would make its implementation possible, the political coherence of the displaced majority, the institutional capacity of the democratic state, the international coordination of governments with aligned interests, are precisely the conditions that the compound's operation has been systematically degrading for the duration of the transition period. The right answer is being organized against conditions that have been specifically constructed to prevent the right answer's implementation. There is a population within the subdued periphery that experiences automation without welfare in a specific form that does not appear in any economic analysis because it does not appear in any employment data. The population of those who provide the care that automation cannot provide, or has not yet been deployed to provide, in the informal, uncompensated, invisible economy of human maintenance. The parents caring for children without the support of public systems that have atrophied. The adult children caring for aging parents without the support of healthcare systems that have been reduced to the management of acute crisis rather than the continuous provision of care. The neighbors, the community members, the informal networks of mutual support that constitute, in the absence of adequate public provision, the actual welfare system of the automated majority. The system that exists below the level of any economic accounting, that appears in no GDP measure, that generates no taxable income, that contributes to no official productivity metric. And that is performing, at scale, at cost, without compensation, the care functions that the compound's automation has not replaced and the public systems have not maintained. And that constitutes, in the subdued periphery, the closest thing to welfare that automation without welfare has left. This invisible system is not resilient. It is not a sustainable substitute for the institutional provision it replaces. It is the system of people doing what they can with what they have in the absence of what they should have. Maintaining, through the accumulated labor of the uncounted, the social fabric that the counted economy has stopped maintaining. And wearing out, quietly, under the weight of the caring that falls to them because the alternative to their caring is not better care. It is no care at all. Automation without welfare is not the end of the story. It is the middle, the condition that generates, in the populations experiencing it, the specific combination of clarity and desperation that prior transitions have consistently produced when the deal breaks and the population that relied on the deal begins to understand that the deal is not being renegotiated. It is not being renegotiated because the compound does not need to negotiate. But the compound is not the only party to the transition. The transition is also being navigated by the automated majority, by the population without leverage, without welfare, without the institutional support of the provision that automation's prior iterations generated. A population that is, for the first time in the history of automation's relationship to welfare, equipped with the analytical tools to understand, precisely, what has happened to it. Not the vague sense of displacement that prior automation waves produced, but the specific, mappable, articulable understanding of which decisions, made where, by whom, produced the conditions being experienced. The understanding that the deal broke not by accident but by design, not by the failure of the system but by the success of the compound-specific architectural choices. And that understanding, however insufficient on its own, is the beginning of the only thing that has ever restored the deal when the deal has been broken. The organization of those who need it around a sufficiently clear understanding of who broke it, why it was broken, and what restoring it would require. The automation is real. The absence of welfare is real. The clarity is also real. And clarity, in sufficient quantity, among a sufficient number of people, who share a sufficient stake in the outcome of the question the clarity is asking, has, historically, been the beginning of the thing that comes next. The deal was never written down, this is what the compound is counting on, the deal was implicit, the uncodified expectation of populations that had learned, through the prior transitions, that displacement would be followed by provision, that automation would be followed by welfare, that the system that took the job would build the replacement, that the machine that made you redundant would fund the program that made you useful again. The deal was never written down because it did not need to be. It was inscribed in the institutions, the unemployment insurance, the public school, the hospital, the pension, that the prior waves produced and that the current wave is allowing to atrophy, not eliminating, atrophying. The deal is not broken, the deal is unfunded, the institutions remain, their capacity has been reduced to the level that makes them technically present and operationally insufficient. Present enough to absorb the political argument that they have been eliminated, insufficient enough to constitute the actual provision. The deal required, the compound did not break the deal, the compound defunded it, starved it of the revenue that the deal required by structuring its capital outside the tax jurisdiction that the deal's provision depends on, the deal atrophies, the institutions hollow, the provision diminishes, and the compound observes, correctly, that the deal has not been broken. The institutions exist, the programs continue, the provision is technically available, while the population experiences, correctly, that the deal is not being honored, that the provision is insufficient, that the institutions cannot deliver, that what technically exists and what actually serves are no longer the same thing. The deal was never written down, but it was real, and the population that is experiencing its realities knows it was real the way you know any implicit agreement was real, by the specific quality of the betrayal when it is broken. Not the explicit violation, the systematic withdrawal, not the announcement, the attrition. Not the broken promise. The unfunded one. The deal is being kept on paper, and broken in the body, and the body knows the difference. 23. Surveillance without services. The watchtower was always a transaction. In the prior arrangement, the social contract attempted to codify and democratic governance attempted to enforce, surveillance was the exchange side of a bilateral relationship. The state watched you. The state also provided for you. The police that monitored the neighborhood also responded when you called. The bureaucracy that tracked your income also administered the insurance when your income disappeared. The system that recorded your status, citizen, resident, worker, taxpayer, also recognized your claim on the services that status entitled you to. Being seen by the state meant being counted by the state, and being counted meant being included in the calculus of provision. The watch was the cost. The service was the return. The surveillance without services that the subdued periphery now inhabits has severed this transaction, has retained the watch while eliminating the return, has kept the system's eye on the population while removing the system's obligation to the population it sees. The watchtower remains. It has become more sophisticated than ever, more comprehensive, more precise, more continuous, in the same period that the services the watchtower's presence once implied have been progressively withdrawn. The eye is open. The hand is closed. To understand how surveillance became severed from services, you must trace the two trajectories separately, the trajectory of surveillance technology and the trajectory of service provision, and observe the divergence that the compound's transition period produced. The surveillance trajectory. Surveillance technology has followed the general curve of digital technology, exponential improvement in capability, exponential reduction in cost, exponential expansion in deployment. The surveillance infrastructure that required, in prior decades, significant state resources to deploy and maintain, the wiretap that needed a court order, the camera that needed a human monitor, the file that needed a clerk to maintain, has been replaced by systems that cost almost nothing to deploy, require almost no human attention to operate, and generate almost unlimited data about the populations within their range. CCTV networks that cover urban areas completely. Mobile phone networks that triangulate location continuously. Financial transaction systems that record every purchase. Social media platforms that map every relationship and interest. Smart city infrastructure that monitors movement, energy use, environmental conditions. Biometric systems that identify individuals at distance. Predictive policing algorithms that flag individuals for attention based on behavioral profiles assembled from all of the above. The cost of watching has fallen to near zero. The coverage of watching has expanded to near total. The surveillance state, the system that knows where you are, what you spend, who you communicate with, what you read, how you move, is not a future scenario. It is the present infrastructure of most of the world's urban environments, and an increasing proportion of its rural ones. The service trajectory. Service provision has followed a different curve, not exponential improvement but linear attrition, the slow, continuous, grinding erosion of public capacity that the compound's fiscal architecture and the political capture of democratic institutions have produced across the same period that surveillance technology was exponentially improving. The public school that has fewer teachers than it did 20 years ago, serving more students, with more complex needs. The hospital that has closed 3 departments since its last renovation, the departments that served the populations with the least capacity to seek care elsewhere. The social services office that has reduced its staff by 40% while the population requiring its services has increased by 30%, producing wait times measured in months for determinations measured in eligibility criteria that have become simultaneously more demanding and more difficult to satisfy. The housing authority whose waiting list is decades long for a stock that has not meaningfully expanded since the era when public housing was considered a legitimate state function. The welfare payment that has been adjusted for inflation in years when the political cost of not adjusting it was high enough to require adjustment, and not adjusted in the years between, its real value declining at the pace of political inattention to the needs of populations with insufficient political leverage to demand consistency. 2 trajectories. 1 rising. 1 falling. Crossing at the point where surveillance capability exceeds service capacity, where the state can see more than it provides, where the watched are no longer cared for by the system watching them. That crossing point has been reached. In most jurisdictions. In most domains. The crossing is the condition. Surveillance without services produces a specific relationship between the population and the state that has no adequate historical precedent. Because prior states that surveilled without serving were recognized as authoritarian by the populations they surveilled. Were understood, by those subject to them, as systems of domination that the surveillance served. The surveillance was the instrument of control. The control was the point. The population understood this. The understanding generated resistance. The surveillance without services of the contemporary periphery is not understood this way, not primarily, not clearly, not with the political legibility that prior authoritarian surveillance generated. Because the surveillance is not primarily deployed by an authoritarian state that has consciously chosen control over provision. It is deployed by a combination of actors, the state, the corporation, the platform, the smart city infrastructure, the compound adjacent data architecture, each of whom has a specific and individually defensible rationale for the surveillance they conduct. The state surveys for security, the corporation surveys for service personalization, the platform surveys for content optimization, the smart city infrastructure surveys for efficiency. None of these actors is primarily motivated by the desire to control the population they are surveilling. They are motivated by their own operational requirements, security, efficiency, profit, that surveillance serves. The control is not the goal. The control is the byproduct. And the byproduct produces the same condition as the intentional authoritarian surveillance, a population that is comprehensively known to systems that do not comprehensively serve it. Without producing the political legibility of the authoritarian model, without the clear enemy, the obvious oppressor, the readily identifiable system of domination around which resistance can be organized. The surveillance is distributed across too many actors with too many different motivations to be named as a single system. The absence of services is distributed across too many institutional failures with too many different causes to be attributed to a single decision. The condition is real. Its political address is not. The data that the surveillance produces about the subdued periphery is not used to serve the periphery. This is the specific character of surveillance without services, not that the data is not used, but that it is used for purposes that serve the surveillors rather than the surveilled. The financial data that reveals the specific texture of the periphery's poverty, which purchases are made first when income is constrained, which services are cut when expenses exceed income, which patterns of financial behavior are produced by the specific form of deprivation the periphery experiences. This data is used not to design better services for the population producing it, not to identify the specific points where intervention would most efficiently address need, but to design better products for the class that can afford them, better risk assessments for the lenders deciding whether to extend credit to the populations whose risk this data allows them to price, better targeting for the advertisers whose products the periphery is being shown despite, or because of, the data indicating they cannot afford them. The health data that reveals the specific biological consequences of the periphery's condition, the chronic stress markers, the early onset of the conditions that inadequate nutrition and inadequate healthcare produce, the accelerated aging of bodies operating under sustained deprivation. This data is used not to provision the healthcare that would address the conditions it reveals, not to redesign the environment that the conditions indicate is producing harm, but to refine the insurance risk models that determine whether the periphery can access the healthcare the data reveals they need, to identify the population segments most likely to incur costs that the healthcare system is least willing to absorb. The surveillance reveals need. The need is assessed for risk. The risk is priced into access. The access is denied to those whose need is greatest. The data is not the service. The data is the mechanism by which the absence of service is most efficiently administered. The compound's relationship to the periphery's surveillance data is the relationship that most reveals the character of surveillance without services. The compound collects data from the periphery continuously, from the platforms it owns, the infrastructure it has invested in, the data brokers it has funded, the smart city systems it has developed for the municipalities that could not afford to develop their own. The data flows inward, from the periphery, through the compound's data architecture, into the compound's analytical systems, where it is processed, enriched, modeled, and deployed in the service of the compound's interests. The compound's interests include perimeter security, the modeling of the periphery's populations for threat assessment, who is organizing, in what direction, with what resources, toward what ends. Labor sourcing, the identification of the specific individuals within the periphery whose skills and dispositions make them candidates for the compound's selective employment, the talent extraction that depletes the periphery of its most capable members. Political management, the assessment of the periphery's political dynamics, which movements are gaining coherence, which leaders are emerging, which grievances are being organized around, and the deployment of the compound's political influence resources to manage those dynamics in the direction of continued periphery fragmentation. Market optimization, the identification of the periphery's remaining economic activity that the compound can access, extract value from, or position itself to service on terms that maximize the compound's return. The compound surveys the periphery more comprehensively than the periphery surveys itself. The compound knows more about the periphery's condition than the periphery's own institutions know. The compound does not use this knowledge to provision the periphery. It uses it to manage the periphery, to maintain the specific condition of managed instability that keeps the periphery insufficient organized to constitute a threat and sufficiently functional to remain a source of the specific inputs the compound still sources from outside. The surveillance is management. The management is not service. The distinction is total. The specific experience of surveillance without services in the periphery's daily life is the experience of being processed by systems that do not respond, of interacting with the state and the platform and the service provider and the algorithm through interfaces that collect everything about the interaction and return nothing that addresses the need that prompted it. The benefits application that requires extensive documentation, proof of income, proof of residence, proof of identity, proof of need, all of which is already known to the systems being applied to, all of which exists in the databases that the applicant is simultaneously being surveilled through. That requires this documentation not because the information is unavailable but because the process of assembling and submitting it is a filter, a mechanism for reducing the number of applicants who successfully navigate the administrative complexity to claim the benefit they are entitled to. The surveillance system knows. The service system does not respond. The knowing and the responding are not connected. They are, deliberately and structurally, disconnected. Because connecting them, using the surveillance data to automatically provision the people whose need it reveals, would expand the service beyond the level the fiscal architecture is prepared to sustain. The disconnection is the policy. The policy is the attrition. The attrition is the welfare system operating as designed not to maximize provision to those who need it but to minimize provision to the level that political cost makes unavoidable. The smart city is the most concentrated expression of surveillance without services, the most legible instantiation of the relationship between the comprehensive watch and the inadequate provision. The smart city's infrastructure monitors continuously traffic flows, energy consumption, air quality, pedestrian movement, noise levels, waste generation, the thermal signatures of buildings, the digital activity of residents. The data is real-time. The coverage is total. The analytical systems are sophisticated. The smart city knows, at any moment, where its congestion is, where its pollution is, where its energy waste is, where its infrastructure is failing, where its residents are concentrated and where they are absent, where the patterns of movement indicate need and where they indicate surplus. The smart city knows all of this. The smart city's response to all of this is proportional not to the knowledge but to the available resources. And the available resources are the resources remaining after the compound's capital has been structured to avoid the tax jurisdiction of the city that is building the infrastructure the compound's data architecture will eventually absorb. The smart city generates the data. The compound systems process the data. The compound identifies the value in the data. The compound captures the value. The city remains. The data is extracted. The services the data should enable are not funded by the value the data generates. Because the value does not return to the jurisdiction that generated it. The city watches. The compound profits. The residents are surveilled and underserved and the data produced by their surveillance makes those who hold it richer and those who generate it no better provisioned than before the watching began. There is a population within the periphery for whom surveillance without services is not the background condition of urban life but the specific, daily, administrated experience of being subject to systems that know everything about you and provide almost nothing for you. The population of those who interact regularly with the welfare state in its contemporary, atrophied form. The person applying for housing assistance, whose financial situation is known to the systems they are applying through, whose residential history is documented, whose employment record is accessible, whose children's school enrollment is on file. Who is nonetheless required to assemble, repeatedly, across multiple visits, across months of process, the same documentation of the same information that the system already holds. Not because the system doesn't know, but because the process of requiring the assembly and submission of documentation that the system already holds is the mechanism by which the system manages the volume of claims it is under-resourced to address. The surveillance is efficient. The service is inefficient by design. The inefficiency is the resource management. The resource management is the policy. The policy is experienced by the applicant as bureaucratic indifference, as the specific quality of being unseen by a system that is, technically, watching everything. Not unseen in the surveillance sense. Unseen in the human sense, not recognized as a person whose circumstances generate a claim on the system's response. Seen as data. Unseen as need. The distinction is the condition. The surveillance without services relationship creates, in those it subjects, a specific and consistent psychological adaptation. An adaptation documented across different populations, different jurisdictions, different specific configurations of the condition, that constitutes the deepest political consequence of the arrangement. Call it surveilled helplessness, the learned inability to expect that the systems watching you will respond to what they see. The prior social contract, whatever its imperfections, created in the population subject to it a sense of political subjecthood, the expectation that the systems they inhabited were, at least nominally, organized around their interests, that a sufficiently legible need, sufficiently clearly communicated, would produce some form of response. This expectation was not always honored. It was often honored poorly. But the expectation itself was the foundation of political agency, the belief that making your need visible to the systems responsible for provision was an act with potential consequence, that the visibility was connected to the response. Surveillance without services destroys this expectation. The surveilled person learns, through the repeated experience of need that is visible to systems that do not respond to it, that visibility produces no consequence. That the documentation of your situation, your financial record, your residential history, your medical condition, is available to the systems that nominally administer your entitlement to provision. And that this availability does not produce provision. That the system sees and the system does not respond. That the connection between visibility and response, the connection that political agency is built on, is broken. And the breaking of that connection produces, in the populations who experience it across sufficient time, the specific learned helplessness of people who have stopped expecting that making their need visible will produce anything. Who have internalized the disconnection as a feature of their condition rather than as a policy choice that a different politics could alter. Who have moved, in their relationship to the systems that govern them, from the position of the political subject making a claim, to the position of the surveilled object awaiting a processing that does not come. The compound's most significant contribution to the condition of surveillance without services is not the surveillance technology it has developed and deployed in the periphery's urban spaces. It is the governance technology it has developed that models the periphery's surveilled population and determines, with the precision of algorithmic assessment, the minimum provision required to maintain the specific stability the compound needs. Not the provision required to address the periphery's need, not the provision that the periphery's welfare would require, but the provision required to prevent the specific forms of organized pressure that the periphery's condition might otherwise generate. The compound's model of the periphery is a stability model, a continuous assessment of the periphery's proximity to the threshold at which its condition produces the form of organized response that the compound's security architecture is designed to manage. The compound is not indifferent to the periphery's condition. It is precisely calibrated to the periphery's condition, monitoring it continuously, modeling its trajectory, assessing its stability. Not because the compound cares about the periphery's welfare but because the periphery's instability is the one risk the compound's architecture has not fully insulated against. The provision the compound supports, the minimum welfare infrastructure its fiscal and political influence allows to persist, is calibrated to this model. Enough provision to keep the periphery below the instability threshold. Not enough provision to address the periphery's need. Not enough to restore the deal. Not enough to honor the obligation. Not enough to constitute the service that surveillance implies. But enough, by the compound's model, to manage the stability that the compound's continued operation requires. The surveillance tells the compound where the periphery is. The model tells the compound how close the periphery is to the threshold. The provision is calibrated to the distance from the threshold. The periphery is not served. The periphery is managed to the precision that the surveillance enables. At the minimum cost the stability model specifies. The specific political consequence of surveillance without services is the inversion of the watched population's relationship to its own visibility. In the prior arrangement, the social contract imagined, visibility was the precondition of provision. You were counted because the counting was the mechanism through which your entitlement was administered. Being seen was being included. In surveillance without services, visibility is the precondition of management. You are counted because the counting is the mechanism through which your stability is monitored. Being seen is being assessed for the risk you represent, the cost you might generate, the threshold you might approach. Not recognized as the person whose need the system is responsible for addressing. The watched population therefore has a specific and rational political interest in the surveillance. It wants to be seen differently. Not unseen. Unseen is dangerous, the condition of those the system has removed from its accounting entirely, the stateless, the undocumented, those whose absence from the system's record makes them invisible to its provision and exposed to its force. Not seen as it is currently seen, as a stability risk to be managed. Seen as a population with claims, with entitlements, with the political standing of the governed rather than the administrative status of the surveilled. The demand is not privacy. The demand is recognition, the reconstitution of the relationship between visibility and response that surveillance without services has severed. See me and serve me. Not, stop watching. Watch and respond. The political movement adequate to surveillance without services is not the privacy movement, the movement that demands the reduction of the state's knowledge of the population it governs. It is the provision movement, the movement that demands the reconnection of the state's knowledge to the state's response. The movement that says, you know everything about us. You know our incomes and our addresses and our health conditions and our children's schools. You know our need. Now serve it. The surveillance without services that the subdued periphery experiences is not permanent in the structural sense, not in the way that the biological class divide is tending toward permanence, not in the way that the immortal boardroom's calcification is permanent. It is permanent in the political sense, permanent in the absence of a political force sufficient to reverse it. Which is a different kind of permanence, not the permanence of the impossible but the permanence of the unorganized. The condition that continues not because it cannot be changed but because the conditions for changing it have not yet been assembled. Because the population with the most direct interest in the change is also the population most comprehensively surveilled, most thoroughly managed for stability, most systematically prevented from the organizational coherence that would constitute the political force the change requires. The surveillance is the management. The management prevents the organization. The prevention of organization perpetuates the surveillance without services. The loop is not unbreakable. Every loop has a break point, the point where the managed condition produces, despite the management, the form of organization the management was designed to prevent. The surveillance tells the compound where the loop is. The model tells the compound how close the break point is. The provision is calibrated to keep the loop intact. But the provision is also the tell, the evidence of the breakpoint's existence, the proof that the compound's model acknowledges the loop is breakable by calibrating the provision to prevent the breaking. The periphery that can read the provision as the evidence of the breakpoint has already found more than the compound intended to reveal. Has found, in the calibration of minimum welfare, the map of the threshold, the compound's own assessment of where the surveillance without services is most likely to produce the form of organized response it is organized to prevent. The surveillance reveals the periphery to the compound. The provision reveals the compound to the periphery. Both revelations are underway. Only one is being watched. The eye was always open, the eye was always open and the hand was also open, open to receive the tax, open to provide the service, open in both directions because the system needed both directions to constitute a system. The eye and the hand together were the state that watched you because watching you was the condition of serving you and served you because serving you was the condition of watching you. The bilateral arrangement that made surveillance something other than dominion. The eye is still open, more open than before, open wider than it has ever been, open at a resolution and a continuity and a comprehensiveness that prior states could not have imagined and would have deployed differently if they had. The hand is closed, not completely. The calibrated minimum remains open, the provision calculated to the stability model's specification, but closed enough that the eye and the hand are no longer a system. They are two separate operations. The eye watches, the hand manages, the watching is comprehensive. The managing is minimal. And the population between them, between the comprehensive eye and the minimal hand, is not governed. It is processed, watched and minimally maintained, surveilled and insufficiently served, known completely and provided for only to the degree that the compound's model specifies as necessary to prevent the watched from becoming the organized, the processed from becoming the political, the surveilled from becoming the seen. The eye is open. The hand is calculating. Between them the periphery waits to be recognized as something more than what the surveillance has decided it is. 24. Managed instability zones. Stability is not the goal. This is the operational truth that every managed instability zone eventually reveals, the truth that the language of development, of humanitarian intervention, of peacekeeping and stabilization is specifically constructed to conceal. Not because the individuals who use this language are uniformly cynical or uniformly dishonest, but because the language is the product of institutions whose interests are not served by stability, whose operational budgets depend on instability, whose contracts require instability, whose presence in the zone is justified by the instability they are nominally deployed to resolve. The managed instability zone is not a zone that failed to stabilize. It is a zone that succeeded at the function it actually serves, the function that no contract names, no mandate acknowledges, no press release describes. The function of maintaining a population in the specific condition of sufficient dysfunction to require continued external management. Sufficient dysfunction to justify the manager's presence, fund the manager's operations, provide the manager's personnel with the specific conditions of impunity that zones of managed instability have always generated. An insufficient dysfunction to produce the collapse that would end the management relationship by eliminating the managed population's remaining utility to those managing it. Not too stable. Not too collapsed. Managed. Haiti is the laboratory. Not because Haiti's condition is uniquely the product of external management, the specific history of Haiti, the only successful slave revolution in the history of the modern world, the nation whose independence was punished by a century of international isolation, debt, embargo, and intervention. This history is Haiti's own, produced by specific actors making specific decisions across specific decades. But because Haiti is the case in which the structure of managed instability is most completely visible, in which the relationship between the zone's dysfunction and the manager's benefit is most clearly documented, in which the gap between the stated purpose of international intervention and its actual operational consequence has been exposed, repeatedly, with sufficient evidence to constitute not an allegation but a pattern. Haiti is the pattern. The pattern is a population in genuine crisis, political, economic, environmental, attracts international response. The response is framed as humanitarian. The humanitarian frame legitimizes the deployment of international personnel and capital to the zone. The personnel and capital do not primarily serve the population. They primarily serve the institutional interests of the organizations deploying them, and the specific personal interests of the personnel deployed. The population remains in crisis. The crisis justifies continued deployment. The deployment continues to serve the institutional and personal interests of those deployed. The population remains in crisis. The loop is not accidental. It is the operational logic of the managed instability zone, the logic that the compound has studied, refined, and deployed at scales and with efficiencies that the prior, cruder versions of the pattern could not achieve. DYN International is not a villain in the operatic sense, not an organization that describes itself as the architect of suffering, not a set of actors who understand their work as the perpetuation of the conditions they are nominally hired to address. It is something more instructive than a villain. It is a case study, the most extensively documented case of the systematic relationship between private military contracting, humanitarian intervention, and the specific conditions of impunity that managed instability zones generate. The documentation is not contested. It is public record, established through congressional testimony, through investigative journalism, through the depositions of whistleblowers who understood what they were witnessing and paid personal costs for the act of witnessing. The pattern, DYN personnel, deployed under contract to Bosnia in the late 1990s as part of the international peacekeeping operation, the operation nominally designed to stabilize a population emerging from ethnic conflict, were found to have been purchasing women and girls as sex slaves. Not a single actor. Not the deviance of one bad person in an otherwise functioning operation. A pattern of conduct, systematic, known within the organization, continuing after internal reports were filed, ending only when the whistleblowers made the conduct visible to audiences outside the organization with the capacity to apply pressure that the organization's internal culture had been structured to absorb. The organizational response was not accountability. It was the termination of the whistleblowers and the continuation of the contracts. The pattern, DYN personnel deployed to Haiti, in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake that killed over 200,000 people and displaced over 1 million, the earthquake that transformed an already managed instability zone into a crisis that attracted the largest humanitarian response in history. These personnel were found to have been involved in the sexual exploitation of minors, in a zone of maximum vulnerability, among a population at maximum disadvantage, in the specific conditions of displacement and institutional collapse that managed instability produces when it is most completely realized. The United Nations peacekeeping mission that operated alongside the contractors, MINUSTA, was found to have introduced cholera to the Haitian population through inadequate sanitation at its own facilities, a disease that killed over 10,000 people, and to have been systematically involved in the sexual exploitation of the population it was deployed to protect. The cover-up of the cholera introduction lasted years. The accountability for the sexual exploitation has been incomplete to the point of effective impunity. The contractors continued to receive contracts. The mission continued to receive mandates. The population continued to be managed. The managing continued to generate the specific conditions of impunity that managed instability zones consistently produce. This is not the exception. This is the structure. The managed instability zone generates impunity as a structural feature, not as a byproduct, not as a failure, but as the predictable output of a specific set of conditions that the zone's management relationship reliably creates. The conditions are: jurisdictional ambiguity. The managed zone exists in a legal space that is neither fully sovereign, the host nation's legal systems have been compromised, displaced, or rendered functionally non-operative by the crisis that justified intervention, nor fully subject to the legal jurisdiction of the intervening actors. The contract worker is not a citizen of the zone. Their conduct is not subject to the zone's compromised legal system. But the contract worker's conduct in the zone is also frequently not subject to the legal system of their home country, which may not have extraterritorial jurisdiction over the specific conduct, or which may have legal frameworks that do not reach the specific actors involved in the specific conduct. The space between these jurisdictions is the impunity zone, the legal nowhere in which conduct that would be criminal in any jurisdiction with a functioning system is effectively without consequence because no functioning system with clear jurisdiction is present to impose one. Information asymmetry. The managed zone's population has severely constrained access to the communication channels through which abuses are documented and accountability is generated. The documentation of harm requires the capacity to document, to record, to communicate, to access the journalists and advocates and legal systems that transform documentation into consequence. The managed zone's population is frequently lacking in all of these capacities, by the conditions of the crisis that generated the management relationship, by the active suppression of communication that would expose the conduct, by the structural disadvantage of populations in survival mode whose capacity for the formal procedures of documentation is crowded out by the more immediate demands of survival. The abusers document nothing. The abused cannot document effectively. The gap between what happens and what is recorded is the operating space of impunity. Institutional protection. The organizations managing the zone, the international contractors, the peacekeeping missions, the humanitarian organizations, have institutional interests in the non-disclosure of conduct that would compromise their continued deployment, their future contracts, their institutional reputations. The institutional interest in concealment is served by the institutional capacity to conceal, the ability to manage internal reporting, to terminate whistleblowers, to deploy legal and public relations resources against the documentation of conduct that the institution has an interest in not documenting. The institution protects the conduct not because the institution endorses the conduct, the institution's public position is invariably that it opposes the conduct and has policies against it, but because the institutional cost of exposure exceeds the institutional cost of concealment, and the institution's interest is the management of institutional cost. The protection is rational. The rationality is the problem. The organ economy of managed instability zones is the extreme expression of the managed zone's most complete logic, the logic that converts the zone's population from the subject of provision to the object of extraction. The organ trade in managed instability zones is documented. It is documented in Haiti, in Kosovo, in Syria, in South Sudan, in the specific zones of maximum vulnerability where the conditions of managed instability have produced populations whose desperation is sufficient to make the calculus of organ sale preferable to the calculus of continued survival in the conditions the zone has produced. The organ economy is not a separate phenomenon from the managed instability zone. It is the managed instability zone's most literal expression. The harvesting of biological value from a population that the management relationship has reduced to the condition in which biological value is the only remaining asset available for transaction. The population that has lost economic leverage, political leverage, social leverage. The population whose labor is not needed, whose consumption is irrelevant, whose political voice cannot reach the systems that govern its condition. This population retains one form of value that the global economy has developed mechanisms to extract. The biological value of the living body. The kidney. The liver segment. The cornea. The biological raw material of the population that has been made redundant in every other dimension. The organ economy is the compound's logic applied to the body, the extraction of value from a population that has been rendered valuable in no other way. The final form of extraction from a population that has been extracted from until the only thing remaining to extract is the body itself. The managed instability zone does not produce the organ economy by design. It produces it by structure, by the specific combination of conditions that its management relationship reliably generates. The desperation sufficient for supply, the impunity sufficient for operation, the jurisdictional ambiguity sufficient for the transaction to occur without legal consequence, the institutional disinterest sufficient to ensure that the documentation of the trade does not produce the accountability that would end it. The organ economy is not the managed zone's secret. It is its operating logic made visible in the body, the logic of extraction without provision, of use without recognition, of the population as resource rather than constituency. The logic the compound applies abstractly, at the systemic level, applied literally, in the zone, to the flesh. The sex economy of managed instability zones follows the same structural logic, the conversion of the population's vulnerability into a resource for the managing class's consumption. The documentation is extensive. Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Liberia, Cambodia. The United Nations has documented its own personnel's involvement. The United States Department of Defense has documented its contractors' involvement. The academic literature is substantial. The journalistic record is clear. What the record shows is not primarily a story of individual predation, though individual predation is present, but a story of structural production. The managed instability zone produces, through the specific conditions of its management relationship, the preconditions for the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable members of its population, predominantly women and girls, by the most protected members of the management relationship, predominantly male, predominantly foreign, predominantly covered by the jurisdictional ambiguity that the management relationship generates. The preconditions. Economic desperation that makes the transaction appear as a rational economic choice to the person entering it, because the alternatives the managed zone offers are worse. Social disintegration that has disrupted the community structures, the family networks, the neighborhood relationships, the informal social systems, that would otherwise provide the protection and the alternatives that might make the transaction unnecessary. Institutional absence of the legal and social services that functioning states provide to prevent and address the exploitation of the vulnerable, the child protection services, the legal advocacy, the shelter systems, the economic alternatives, all absent or severely compromised by the crisis that generated the management relationship. Impunity infrastructure that protects the exploiters from consequence, the jurisdictional ambiguity, the institutional concealment, the power differential between the exploiters' organizations and the exploited population's capacity to generate accountability. The managed zone does not intend to produce these conditions. The managed zone produces them as the predictable output of its structural relationship, the relationship between a population in maximum vulnerability and a management class in maximum impunity. And the predictable output is the predictable conduct that maximum vulnerability and maximum impunity have produced wherever they have been combined in the history of managed instability. The compound's relationship to managed instability zones is not the relationship of the humanitarian organization or the peacekeeping mission, the organizations whose involvement is at least nominally oriented toward the zone's eventual stabilization. The compound's relationship is the relationship of the investor and the architect. The compound invests in managed instability, not directly, not visibly, not in ways that produce the documentary record that generates accountability. but through the layers of financial architecture that place the compound's capital at sufficient remove from the specific transactions that the managed zone enables to ensure that the capital's return is captured while the capital's involvement remains deniable. The resource extraction operations that the managed zone's instability enables, the mining concessions, the agricultural land acquisitions, the infrastructure contracts, financed through structures that are compound adjacent without being compound identified. The data extraction operations that the managed zone's population enables, the behavioral data of desperate populations interacting with crisis response platforms, the biometric data of displaced populations processed through humanitarian registration systems, the financial data of populations engaging with emergency payment systems. All flowing into data architectures that the compound's analytical infrastructure is positioned to access and exploit. The compound is the architect in the sense that the managed zone's instability does not happen to the compound happens to the zone. The compound's capital architecture, its trade agreements, its extraction of the host nation's most capable people through selective immigration, its structuring of debt that constrains the host nation's fiscal capacity for independent public provision, its funding of the political forces within the zone that oppose the institutional development that would reduce the zone's dependence on external management. These are not the compound's interventions in the zone. They are the zone's production. The zone is what these interventions produce. The managed instability zone is not a failure of the compound's engagement. It is its product. The parallel to the Iran theocracy's governance logic and Taliban-era Afghanistan's management of populations, the control inward, disengagement outward structure, is precise at the structural level. The theocratic governance structure that organizes itself around the preservation of the governing class's position, extracting from the population what the governing class requires, providing the population with what stability demands, disengaging from the population's welfare beyond the minimum that instability management requires. This is the managed instability zone's logic at the level of the nation-state. The Taliban's management of Afghanistan during its governance periods, the extraction of resources, the maintenance of sufficient order to allow extraction to continue, the provision of sufficient control to prevent the organized resistance that would disrupt extraction, the complete disengagement from the population's welfare beyond what control requires. This is the managed instability zone's logic at the level of the conquered territory. Both models share the essential feature that distinguishes management from governance. The managed population is not the constituency. The governing class's constituency is the governing class itself, its continued existence, its continued position, its continued extraction. The population is the resource from which extraction occurs, managed, as all resources are managed, to prevent the degradation that would reduce the extraction's yield. But not governed, not provided for, not served. Because service requires recognizing the population as the constituency. And recognition is what the management relationship is specifically organized to avoid. The compound is the theocracy without the theology. The compound is the Taliban without the ideology. The governing class that does not need God or revolution as justification, that uses efficiency as its theology and optimization as its ideology. And that produces, by these means, the same structural relationship to the population it manages. Control inward. Extraction outward. Disengagement from what happens to those from whom the extraction proceeds. Managed instability, as the permanent condition of the periphery, the compound has decided it does not need to govern. Only to manage. Only to watch. Only to ensure remains sufficiently unstable to require management. And sufficiently stable to remain worth managing. The managed instability zone's population is not passive. This is the correction that every analysis of managed instability must make explicit, the resistance to the framing that the zone's management most wants to produce. The framing of the managed population as the inevitable product of its conditions, as people whose suffering reflects their situation rather than the decisions of the actors who maintain it. The population of every managed instability zone has organized resistance, has produced, from within the conditions of manufactured vulnerability, the specific forms of collective action that the conditions permit. Haiti has produced, across its entire history, the most sustained tradition of popular resistance of any nation in the Western Hemisphere, a tradition that began with the revolution that terrified every slave-owning power in the world and that has continued, through every subsequent period of occupation, debt bondage, dictatorship, and managed instability, informs that the management relationship has consistently underestimated because the management relationship looks at the zone through the frame of its own interests and sees the population as the problem to be managed rather than the force to be reckoned with. The managed population organizes within the conditions of management. The organization is constrained by those conditions, is less effective than it would be in conditions of greater resource and stability. But constraint does not eliminate. Constraint shapes. The forms of organization that emerge in managed instability zones are shaped by the specific conditions the management relationship produces. And they are, consistently, forms the management relationship did not anticipate because the management relationship designed its analytical systems around what managed populations are in their current condition. Not what managed populations become when the constraint generates the specific creativity of the people with nothing left to lose except the solidarity that the management relationship cannot price or automate or surveil into disappearance. The managed instability zone's future, the trajectory that the compound's management is currently producing, is not infinite continuation of the current condition. No condition is stable in the long run. The management relationship generates, within the populations it manages, the conditions for its own eventual disruption. Not through the inevitable logic of historical materialism, not through any guaranteed arc of political development, but through the specific dynamic of a management relationship that extracts without providing, that surveils without serving, that maintains the population in the specific condition of deprivation that produces, over sufficient time, the specific form of organized clarity about what is happening and why. The clarity that the organ economy makes visceral, the clarity that the sex economy makes personal, the clarity that the surveillance without services makes daily. The clarity that comes from having your body converted into a resource by the management relationship that was supposed to protect it. That clarity is not theoretical. It is not analytical. It is not the product of the distributed intelligence tools that the compound distributed during the transition period. It is older than those tools. It is the clarity of the body, the knowledge that comes from the specific experience of having been used. The knowledge that has generated every prior disruption of every prior management relationship that mistook the population's managed condition for the population's permanent nature. The knowledge that says, we know what you are doing. We know what you have been doing. We know the structure. And we are building something adequate to it. The managed population has been building for a long time, in the conditions the management allowed, with the resources the extraction left, toward the form of organization that the management relationship cannot absorb. And the building is further along than the compound's models have assessed. Because the compound's models assess managed populations by the metrics of managed populations. And the thing being built is not visible to those metrics. It is visible only from inside the managed condition, which the compound's analysts are not inside, and which the compound sensors are not calibrated to see. The humanitarian organizations arrived. They arrived with mandates and budgets and the specific authority of the international system that had decided this population needed management. They arrived and they built their compounds, the small compounds within the large managed zone, the walls within the walls, inside, the generators, the imported food, the per diems and the hazard pay and the specific social world of people managing a crisis from a position of protected distance, outside, the crisis that justified the management, the crisis that funded the per diem, the crisis that would end if the management were adequate, and that did not end because the management was not adequate, because adequacy would end the management relationship and the management relationship was the point. The children in the camps knew the difference between the organization that came to help and the organization that came to stay. The staying was the help. The help was the staying required the crisis. The crisis required management. The management required the crisis. The children grew up in the camps and understood the loop before they had language for it, understood it in the body, in the specific experience of being the object of a management relationship that called itself help. The body knows, the body that has been extracted from knows, the body that has been used for what it was not meant to be used for by those who claim to be protecting it, that body knows. And knowing, it remembers, and remembering, it organizes, not toward the Management relationships preferred form of stability towards something else, something the management relationship has no category for because the management relationship has no category for the intelligency of those it manages, for the specific and ferocious clarity of people who have been comprehensively understood and comprehensively used and who have, therefore, comprehensively understood the thing that is using them, and are building, in the space that understanding opens, the thing that comes. After management. The thing the compound has not yet learned to model, because the compound has not yet learned to model what people build when what they are building is built specifically against it. 25. The geography of abandonment. Abandonment has a shape. This is the first thing that the geography of abandonment reveals, the thing that distinguishes the analysis of space from the analysis of policy, the mapping of territory from the accounting of decisions. That abandonment is not uniform. It does not fall evenly across the landscape like rain. It falls in patterns, specific, legible, mappable patterns that reveal, when read correctly, the precise logic of the compound's withdrawal, the specific calculation of what was worth maintaining and what was not, the geometry of the decision expressed in the landscape it produced. Read the map of abandonment and you read the compound's values more honestly than any document it has published, more honestly than any mission statement, any philanthropic commitment, any public philosophy of its relationship to the world it is withdrawing from. The map does not lie. The map is what was decided written in the landscape, in the closed hospital, the unmaintained road, the school whose roof was not repaired, the water system whose pipes were not replaced, the neighborhood whose investment followed the capital that followed the compound that followed the calculation that concluded this place was not worth the cost of continuing. The geography of abandonment has been produced before. Every prior period of concentrated capital withdrawal from defined territories has produced a legible geography, a landscape of the decision written in the built environment of the places where the decision was made. The deindustrialization of the American Midwest, the geography of the Rust Belt, is the prior century's most extensively documented geography of abandonment, the factories that closed, the tax base that collapsed, the services that atrophied, the populations that remained after the mobile capital had followed the cheaper labor to where the compound's predecessor logic pointed. The geography is specific. It has a texture, the specific texture of a place that was built for a function the function has left, the oversized infrastructure, the housing stock calibrated for a workforce that no longer lives there, the civic architecture of a city that expected to continue growing and instead contracted. The specific aesthetic of the place that time has passed. That texture, the Rust Belt texture, is the predecessor of the texture now spreading across the geography of abandonment that the compound's transition is producing. Not only in the former industrial heartlands. Everywhere. The abandonment is no longer the localized consequence of a specific industry's departure. It is the generalized consequence of the compound's withdrawal, the withdrawal of the class whose investment maintained not merely the specific industry but the entire architecture of provision that the industry's tax base supported. The school, the hospital, the library, the maintained road, the functioning water system, the social infrastructure of the place that expected to remain worth investing in. The geography of abandonment has a center and a periphery, not in the global sense of core and periphery but in the local sense, the specific spatial structure that abandonment produces within any given region as the withdrawal proceeds. The inner abandonment zone. The places closest to the compound, the neighborhoods, the towns, the urban districts that exist in the compound's physical proximity, experience the specific abandonment of adjacency without access. These are the places that can see the compound, literally, in some cases, the perimeter is visible, the towers of the compound's interior are visible above the wall. But that cannot enter it, that exist in the compound's shadow without existing in its provision. The inner abandonment zone is the most visible manifestation of the geography of abandonment, the place where the contrast between the compound's maintained interior and the unmaintained exterior is most legible, most immediate, most physically present in the daily experience of the populations who inhabit it. The compound has produced economic activity in the inner abandonment zone, the service economy that the compound sources from outside its walls, the construction that its ongoing expansion requires, the logistics that its consumption demands. But this economic activity does not produce the provision that prior economic activity produced, because it is procurement rather than employment, transaction rather than relationship, extraction rather than investment. The inner abandonment zone has income without stability, economic activity without economic development, the compound's proximity without the compound's provision. The specific condition of being close enough to see what you cannot access, which is, in its political consequences, the most radicalizing condition the geography of abandonment produces. Proximity is clarifying. The inner abandonment zone cannot maintain the illusion that the compound is distant, theoretical, someone else's concern. The compound is visible from here. Its towers catch the light. Its maintained infrastructure is audible, the hum of its energy systems, the movement of its automated logistics, above the silence of the unmaintained on this side of the wall. The inner abandonment zone knows exactly what the compound is. It lives inside that knowledge every day. The middle abandonment zone. Further from the compound, the regional territories whose connection to the compound's economy is mediated through supply chains and procurement, whose populations provide the labor that the compound's full automation has not yet eliminated, whose institutions retain more formal functionality than the inner zone but have been progressively hollowed of the capacity to deliver what their formal mandate describes. These are the zones of institutional attrition, the places where the school is technically open, the hospital technically operating, the government technically governing, but where the technical presence and the actual capacity have diverged far enough that the institution is providing a reduced version of what it is supposed to provide. And the reduction is not acknowledged as policy but experienced as failure. The specific demoralization of populations whose institutions have stopped delivering without stopping existing. Who cannot point to the moment the service ended because the service has not ended, it has just become insufficient. Insufficient in ways that accumulate without drama, that become visible only in retrospect, in the comparison between what the institution delivers now and what the institution delivered before the attrition that no one announced and no one can be made to answer for. The outer abandonment zone. At the furthest remove, the territories that the compound's economy has not found a use for, whose populations provide nothing the compound requires, whose resources have been extracted or were never valuable enough to extract, whose infrastructure was never built to the standard that integration requires. These are the zones of complete withdrawal, the places where the state is present only in its enforcement function, the police, the border agency, the tax collector, and absent in its provision function, the school, the hospital, the road maintenance, the water system. Where the compound's logic has reached its most complete expression. This place has no value to us, its population has no utility to us. We will extract what there is to extract. We will enforce what must be enforced. We will provide nothing. The outer abandonment zone is the geography of the abandoned majority in its most concentrated form, the place where the compound's decision about what is worth maintaining has been most completely implemented. And where the populations who remain are living, in the most literal sense, in the landscape of having been decided against. The geography of abandonment is also a geography of bodies, of the specific biological consequences of living in spaces where the infrastructure of health has been withdrawn. This is the dimension of the geography of abandonment that connects most directly to the biological class divide, the physical expression, in the landscapes of the subdued periphery, of the decision to not invest in the bodies of the populations who inhabit them. The water that is not clean, not visibly contaminated, not the acute crisis of cholera or dysentery, but the chronic, low-level contamination of infrastructure that has not been maintained, pipes that have not been replaced, treatment systems that are underfunded, producing the specific health consequences of long-term exposure to water that is technically compliant with standards that have not been updated to reflect the specific contaminants that the specific infrastructure's specific age is specifically producing. The air that is not clean, not the acute crisis of industrial accident but the chronic, low-level degradation of the specific air quality that the compound's adjacent operations, its logistics, its energy infrastructure, its construction activity produces in the territories around it. Territories where the populations have the least capacity to monitor the air quality, the least political leverage to enforce the standards that would require its improvement, the least access to the healthcare that would manage the consequences of breathing the air that the compound's operation produces as an externality it has structured itself to not account for. The food that is not adequate, not the acute crisis of famine but the chronic inadequacy of the food desert, the geography of food access that the compound's retail architecture has produced by following the capital away from the inner abandonment zone, leaving behind the specific landscape of the place where fresh produce is available at distance and processed food is available at proximity. The geography that produces the specific chronic conditions, cardiovascular, metabolic, inflammatory, of populations whose nutrition reflects not their preferences but their geography. The specific place that the compound decided was not worth a grocery store. The housing that is not safe, not the acute crisis of structural failure but the chronic inadequacy of the housing stock that is available to the populations the compound has not selected. The lead paint that was not remediated, the mold that was not addressed, the heating system that was not maintained, the insulation that was not installed. The specific residential conditions that produce the specific health consequences of living in buildings whose maintenance was deferred by owners whose investment calculation reached the same conclusion as the compound's. This population, in this geography, is not worth the cost of adequate maintenance. The geography of abandonment is written in the bodies of the populations who inhabit it. In the chronic conditions that the abandoned infrastructure produces, in the accelerated aging of bodies maintained in environments that the compound has decided are not worth maintaining. In the specific biological expression of having been decided against in the spatial allocation of the investment that determines what kind of body a place produces. The geography of abandonment has a specific relationship to mobility, to the capacity to leave the abandoned geography for a geography that is less abandoned, that reveals the abandonment's most complete political dimension. The populations most thoroughly abandoned are the populations least able to move. This is not coincidence. It is the structural relationship between the geography of abandonment and the geography of capital, between the places capital has left and the populations capital has left behind. Capital is mobile. Capital followed the compound, followed the opportunity that the compound's development created, followed the infrastructure that the compound's investment built, followed the calculation that the compound's geography was worth being adjacent to. The capital left. The populations whose lives were organized around the capital's presence could not follow at the same speed, were anchored, by the specific texture of their lives, to the geographies the capital had left. The house that was paid for and was now worth a fraction of what they needed to establish themselves elsewhere. The community that they had built, the relationships, the social infrastructure, the networks of mutual support, that existed here and would have to be rebuilt from nothing in the geography the capital had moved to. The family members who could not move, the elderly parent, the child in the school whose disruption was unthinkable, the sibling whose situation required proximity. The specific texture of embeddedness that is the content of a life and the weight of an anchor when the place the life was built in is being abandoned by the forces that made it inhabitable. The people who can move move. The people who can most easily move, the most educated, the most mobile, the most economically independent, move first and furthest. The people who move are the people the abandoned geography most needs to retain, the people whose capability and whose economic activity and whose social contribution might constitute the basis for the geography's own regeneration. Their departure is not betrayal. It is the rational response to the compound's calculation, the adoption, by individuals, of the same logic that the compound applied to the territory. This place is not worth the cost of continuing. The geography of abandonment therefore produces, through the specific mechanism of mobility, its own accelerating abandonment. The departure of the most mobile leaving behind the least mobile, the concentration of disadvantage in the geography from which advantage has departed. The specific dynamic of compounding abandonment in which every departure makes the remaining geography less capable of generating the conditions that would make remaining worthwhile. The loop runs until it doesn't, until the geography has been abandoned to the point where it either generates the conditions for its own irreversible collapse or generates, from the specific populations who could not leave, the conditions for something that was not possible when the mobile capital was still present. The geography of abandonment has been studied, mapped, documented, analyzed, by geographers and economists and sociologists who have produced an extensive literature of what is lost when places are abandoned. The literature is important. It names what is happening. It generates the documentation that makes the pattern visible. But the literature has a consistent limitation, the limitation of the observer looking at the abandoned geography from outside it. The limitation that produces the frame of loss, the abandoned geography as the place where things used to be that are no longer there, the closed factory, the empty storefront, the declining population, the atrophying institution. The frame of loss is accurate. It describes what has left. What it consistently fails to adequately describe is what has remained, and what has been built in the space that departure created. The specific forms of organization, of mutual provision, of collective ingenuity, that the abandoned geography produces in the populations who remain. Because abandonment, however painful, is also clarification, the removal of the structures that organized the geography around the interests of those who have now left, the opening of a space in which the populations who remain can organize the geography around their own interests for the first time. The geography of abandonment is also the geography of potential, not inevitably realized, not automatically productive, not without the cost of the abandonment that created it. But potential nonetheless, the potential of people who are no longer organized around the requirements of the capital that has left, who are no longer managed by the institutions that have atrophied, who are facing the specific question that abandonment forces. What do we build here, for us, with what we have? That question, forced by abandonment, answered by the populations who remain, is the question the geography of abandonment eventually produces in every place it creates. Not everywhere. Not inevitably. Not without the cost of generations that bore the abandonment before the question became answerable. But the question comes. And the answers, when they come, are not the answers the compound anticipated. Because the compound's analysis of what the abandoned geography might produce was conducted with the frame of the investor, the frame that sees the territory as a resource to be developed or not developed based on the calculation of return on investment. And the frame of the investor cannot see what is built in the territory the investor has decided is not worth developing. The geography of abandonment has a specific political temporality, a relationship to time that distinguishes it from the geography of crisis. The geography of crisis is acute, the flood, the war, the epidemic, the event that produces rapid, visible, dramatic harm to a defined population in a defined place. Crisis produces response, the humanitarian response, the emergency intervention, the reconstruction effort, because crisis is legible, its timeline is clear, its endpoint is imaginable. The geography of abandonment is chronic, the slow withdrawal, the gradual attrition, the incremental defunding that produces, over decades, the conditions that crisis produces in weeks. Chronic harm does not produce response the way acute harm does. Chronic harm is background, the condition that is present so persistently that it becomes the texture of normal life in the abandoned geography, the school that has always been like this, the hospital that has always been insufficient, the road that has always been in this condition. Always, in the frame of the person who grew up here, always, though in fact the always is 30 years, 40 years, the period of the compound's withdrawal that has produced the conditions that feel like permanence because they predate the memory of most of those who inhabit them. The chronic harm does not produce the response it would produce if it arrived acutely. It produces, instead, the specific adaptation of populations who have learned to live within the constraints that the abandonment has imposed, who have built their lives around the limitations that the abandoned geography presents. And who have therefore built, within those limitations, a knowledge of the geography that the compound does not have. The specific, intimate, embodied knowledge of people who have lived in the abandoned space and built within it and maintained within it and loved within it and organized within it. The knowledge that the compound's analytical systems cannot generate from the data the compound collects about the abandoned geography because the compound has not been here. Has only surveilled here. And surveillance is not presence. And presence is where the knowledge is. The geography of abandonment will not remain the geography of abandonment indefinitely. This is the prediction that the compound's models most consistently and most consequentially fail to generate. Not because the models are unsophisticated, they are very sophisticated. But because the models are trained on the data of the abandonment's current state. On what the abandoned geography currently is. And not on what abandoned geographies have become, historically, when the populations who remained in them reached the specific point of organizational clarity that chronic abandonment, eventually, produces. The organizational clarity is not inevitable. It is not automatic. It does not arise from abandonment alone. It arises from abandonment combined with the specific analytical tools that the compound distributed during the transition period. The tools that make visible what the abandonment is, who produced it, why it was produced, where it can be interrupted, what form of organization is adequate to interrupt it. The abandoned geography, equipped with these tools, is not merely the geography of what has been lost. It is the geography of people who understand, with unprecedented clarity, what was taken from them, by whom, and what returning it would require. That understanding does not produce organization automatically. But it is the precondition of organization, the analytical foundation on which adequate political response is built. And the building, quiet, distributed, without announcement, in the specific places the compound has decided are not worth watching closely, is underway. The compound has made a miscalculation. Not in its analysis of the abandoned geography's current condition, that analysis is accurate. In its analysis of what the abandoned geography is producing, what the populations who remain are building in the space of their abandonment. The miscalculation of the investor who has exited a territory and stopped paying attention to it. Who is watching the territory's value by the metrics that mattered when the territory was worth investing in, and is not watching for the different kind of value that territories produce when the investment has left and the people who remain are building something that is not visible to the metrics that measure investable value. The compound watches the abandoned geography for instability, for the specific forms of disorder that would require the compound's security architecture to respond. The compound is not watching for the forms of organization that do not yet constitute instability, that are, currently, below the threshold of the compound's detection, that are being built in the abandoned geographies, in the communities the compound has decided are not worth watching closely, by the people the compound has decided are not worth assessing carefully, toward the thing the compound has not modeled. Because the thing that is being built is built specifically to be unmodelable by the systems the compound uses to model what it is afraid of. The abandoned geography is the compound's blind spot. The blind spot is where the thing the compound cannot see coming is being assembled. In the specific spaces, by the specific people, with the specific knowledge of what the compound is and what it has done and where it is vulnerable. The knowledge that comes from living in the landscape of its decisions. From reading the map of abandonment. And understanding, from the inside of what was abandoned, what the abandonment reveals about the thing that abandoned it. And where the wall is weakest. And what is on the other side. And how to reach it. Not from a distance. But from here. From the abandoned geography. From the place the compound decided was not worth the cost of continuing. Which turns out to have been exactly the place the compound should have continued to watch. Every map has edges, the edge of the map is not the edge of the world. It is the edge of the map maker's interest, the place where the attention that produces the map ran out, where the territory was judged insufficient to merit the effort of detailed representation. Beyond the edge of the map, here be dragons, the cartographer's confession of the limits of their knowledge, the admission that the world continues past the point where the map maker stopped looking. The compound has a map, the map is very detailed, the map is continuously updated, the map is the most sophisticated cartographic instrument in the history of governance, comprehensive, precise, real-time, predictive. The map has edges, the edges are the abandoned geographies, the places the compound's attention has determined are not worth the detail of close representation. The abandoned geographies appear on the map, they appear in low resolution, the stability metrics, the instability thresholds, the broad strokes of the managed condition. What does not appear on the map is what is happening at the resolution below the compound's surveillance, in the specific communities, the specific conversations, the specific forms of building that are occurring below the threshold of the compound's detection. Here be dragons, the compound's confession of the limits of its knowledge, the admission, encoded in the low resolution of the abandoned geography's representation, that the world continues past the point where the compound stopped looking. The world continues, the abandoned geography continues, the people in the abandoned geography continue, building, organizing, remembering, mapping their own map of what is happening to them and why and who and where their edges are. The compound's map has edges, the people's map has the compound at its center, understood from the outside, mapped from below, studied with the specific attention of those who have every raison to understand what they are studying, because what they are studying is the thing that decided they were not worth the cost of the maps. Detail. And they intend to be very detailed in return.
A Mary Antoinette moment hangs in the air. Fancy lies whisper while the people stare. The feds march on deaf to the cries. State lines fracture under darkening skies. RNA shadow skies twist and bend. Election ghost hat where truth should begin. Liberty's pulse beats at the edge of the fray, while the police state tightens its grip every day. Oh, the chains are silent but they're tightening still. AI's cold fingers bend the human will. From Stargate's eye to the drones in flight. Freedom's a memory lost in the night, where tax slaves waken to a thief's cruel game. A tale of two cities burning in shame. Free speech chokes on a censor's blade. Whistleblowers hunted, their warnings fade. Flagged for thoughts for who we know. Martial law hums where shadows grow. Trump's machine hums digital throne. Not shrinking power but carving stone. AI's a beast, probabilities reign. Leveraging control through a tyrant's brain. Oh, the chains are silent but they're tightening still. AI's cold fingers bend the human will. From Stargate's eye to the drones in flight. Freedom's a memory lost in the night, where tax slaves waken to a thief's cruel game. A tale of two cities burning in shame. Smart cities rise, credits locked tight. Drones overhead hum through the night. Snowden's ghost screams from the void. A patriot's truth, the state destroyed. Medicine hijacked, life's decay. Depopulation whispers in the mRNA. Grocery lines stretch, prices scream. Normal's a lie sold in a fading dream. The media spins a puppet charade. Wet not yin, but sharpens the blade. Transhumed dreams in a sterile haze. Controls the god of these final days. The states fight back, a flicker of light, but the Stargate looms, swallowing sight. AI's the tool, oppression refined. A handful of masters enslave mankind. Oh, the chains are silent but they're tightening still. AI's cold fingers bend the human will. From Stargate's eye to the drones in flight. Freedom's a memory lost in the night, where tax slaves waken to a thief's cruel game. A tale of two cities burning in shame. Outro a warning unheeded, a comment of healing, unhealing, healing, and SUBDUED. Oh, the chains are silent but they're tightening still. AI's cold fingers bend the human will. From Stargate's eye to the drones in flight. Freedom's a memory lost in the night, where tax slaves waken to a thief's cruel game. A tale of two cities burning in shame. Where tax slaves waken to a thief's cruel game. A tale of two cities burning in shame. The system fractures, cracks in the wall. Resistance whispers through patriots' call. Digital soldiers break through the noise as power structures lose their poise. The truth awakes like thunder's sound, breaking the spell that kept us bound. Revolution seed takes root in the mind. A new beginning for all. Oh, the chains are silent but they're tightening still. AI's cold fingers bend the human will. From Stargate's eye to the drones in flight. Freedom's a memory lost in the night, where tax slaves waken to a thief's cruel game. A tale of two cities burning in shame. Outro a warning unheeded, a comment of healing, unhealing, healing, and SUBDUED. Oh, the chains are silent but they're tightening still. AI's cold fingers bend the human will. From Stargate's eye to the drones in flight. Freedom's a memory lost in the night, where tax slaves waken to a thief's cruel game. A tale of two cities burning in shame. A tale of two cities burning in shame. The masses frightened, can't be contained as corrupt institutions finally drew close. Surveillance falters, the watchers exposed. The people speaking call to all free men. The digital prisons begin to fail as sovereign citizens remove the veil. A great awakening sweeps through the land, power returning to the people's hand. Oh, the chains are silent but they're tightening still. AI's cold fingers bend the human will. From Stargate's eye to the drones in flight. Freedom's a memory lost in the night. Oh, the chains were silent but now they break. The human spirit fully awake. From corruption's depths to freedom's height. Liberty's torch burns through the night. No longer slaves to the master's fame. A new republic rises from the flame. Final decoration, the facade crumbles day to day. Digital control begins to sway. Information warriors break through the noise as censorship loses its deadly poise. Citizens unite across the divide, no longer willing to stand aside. From shadow to light, the truth now shines, breaking the spell that clouded our minds. The chains have fallen, we're standing tall, reclaiming futures once lost to all. From surveillance states to sovereign men, freedom's fire burns bright again. No longer pawns in their twisted game. A new republic rises out with shame. The people's voice, a thunderous sound. Liberty's spirit forever unbound.